Hello and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie couch with Sophie Capewell. Sophie's a track sprint cyclist for the Great Britain cycling team. She won gold in the team sprint event alongside teammates Katie Marchant and Emma Finucane at the 2024 Paris Olympic Games, setting 3 new world records in the process. The team then became the first ever British women's sprint team to do the double and take the world title a few months later. Sophie's been cycling from a very young age and is currently studying for a maths degree. Sophie Capewell, welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
Good today. Yeah, very good. Start of the off season, so feel a bit more rested and recovered at the minute, which is quite nice.
Good. So I'm going to jump straight in, Sophie, if that's okay with you, and ask if you've had a significant bereavement in your life that you could maybe talk to me about today.
Yeah, so my dad passed away in 2021. He had, I'm going to butcher this, but cholangiocarcinoma, which is like a bile duct cancer. And he was ill for quite a few years. We thought he went into remission. It came back. Every time he tried to have treatment again, he kept getting sepsis. And he actually made the decision to stop treatment. And originally we were told he had 2 to 3 weeks and he lived for 10 more months because that's very much my dad's nature, very stubborn. And yeah, unfortunately we lost him at the end of 2021. And I think, that's probably the most significant loss I'd had. We lost my granddad a couple months earlier to leukemia as well. So it was kind of everything all at once. But yeah, pretty tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just go back to, so when your dad, he'd made the decision to stop his treatment and he knew that his life was going to be shorter and limited and surprised everyone with 10 months by the sounds of it. What kinds of conversations, if any, about death and dying was he having or were you all having as a family?
Yeah, well, I think it was really strange how the conversation kind of started. So he had just gone through another bout of sepsis. It was right before Christmas, and we weren't sure if he was going to make it out of the hospital in time to come home and spend some time with the family. We were also on the back end of COVID, so when he was in the hospital, we couldn't be in the hospital, or they tried to limit that at least. And then he managed to make it out for Christmas, and I think I remember waking up on Boxing Day, and I heard my parents crying in the other room. So we all went in and had a conversation about the fact that this almost was the lesser of two evils. It was his decision and he was very content with the fact that that's the direction he wanted to go in. I remember finding it really difficult listening to that because in my head, it felt like he made that decision and it felt like he was almost giving up. I didn't fully understand the whole context around it. And obviously you think about your own feelings first because you can relate to them over knowing that like that was the best decision for him at the time and that was something that he'd come to terms with and was actually really happy about. The conversations that then followed kind of went in the complete opposite direction. We were all very emotional and there was a lot of conversations around what we would miss out on and things like jumping really far ahead into the future of, well, I'm not going to see that and I'm not going to see that. But then we kind of brought everything back a little bit to, well, we're going to try and enjoy the now. And yes, you might not see that, but think about all the good things that you did get to see and enjoy. And that's where we ended up.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think for those who might be listening, who are caring for someone, and it could be a parent, who has a terminal illness and is dying. What we hear from people who listen to the podcast is it's really helpful and supportive hearing other people's experiences. And also, people can take kind of ideas from other people's experiences, but also can take strength from them as well. And it sometimes can urge people to maybe have some of those conversations that they've been scared to have as well, because they're not easy conversations to have, are they?
No, definitely not. And I'm an athlete, and that year I was training to be the reserve for the Tokyo Olympics. So there was a lot going on. And I remember at the time I decided I was just going to stay at home. I wasn't going to go back to Manchester and train. I just, because we were told 2 to 3 weeks as well, we just stayed at home. And then my dad actually was the one who turned around to me and he was like, "What are you doing? I don't want you to sit here and wait and watch me dying, like waiting for me to die, staring at me on the sofa." He was like, "This is not the end of everybody's like life. Go live your life." And obviously, he lived for quite a while after that point. But it was a bit of a reality check because it feels like sometimes that first conversation, everything just stops. You put like life just kind of halts. Even though everyone else's life keeps going, yours feels like it stops. And it's really important to remember that's not the case. You have to keep living until you can't for everybody involved. It felt really alien at first. It felt like you were having to really force yourself into that. But as time went on, it got a little bit easier and you get into a routine with it. But, like, I was really fortunate that my family was set up that way. My mum, and my sister were my dad's primary carers because they wanted me to go and try and do this other thing that he was enjoying watching me do, which gave him a lot of, peace and, like, he enjoyed watching me try and pursue my dreams, so I was very lucky in that sense, but also, yeah, it was very, very peculiar at the same time.
And I think that, what you've just said there about it being alien, but actually, pushing yourself forward and or pushing yourself into it, then you can start to get your head around it in some form. And I think that's a really key message, isn't it? That of course it's alien because, for many people, they've never ever experienced this before. And, you certainly haven't experienced your dad dying before. And so it's completely alien, isn't it? It's like, how am I supposed to think? How am I supposed to feel? What am I supposed to do? And then, of course, within the family, everybody's having their own unique experiences as well, because they've all got their own stuff going on. You had, as you've just said, kind of preparing for Tokyo, and everybody's got their own work and life and other stuff going on at the same time as well, haven't they? So it impacts in different ways for everybody within the same family.
Yeah, definitely. And we found points in the year where me, my sister, and my mum felt like we were all in complete different stages. So I think I started grieving my dad really early on, even though he was still with us, because I kept removing myself from the situation to come back and forth from Manchester. Every time I came back, I saw a bit more of a change than they were with him all the time, every day. But they had a very different battle that they were facing because it was a very taxing and hard struggle because they had to start to become carers for somebody who a couple months ago was extremely self-capable and has been his entire life. And that adjustment was massive because we had two very well, we had similar experiences, but very polar opposite experiences at the same time. And then we also had conversations down the line where my sister was a little bit envious that I managed to escape, but then I was a bit envious that she got to spend more time with him and things like that. And it was really strange to kind of navigate that because each one of us had a very different experience of that, and we will never fully understand what each other went through. And yet we have the best understanding of what each other went through also. So it took a little bit of time to kind of like get into a more of a flow with conversations and have that better understanding and able to kind of like talk through it a bit more and have like that harmonious, like, I get it now. I understand why you feel like that. I understand why you had the reaction, and same back the other way.
Yeah, yeah. You're all kind of navigating each other as well, aren't you? As well as navigating the situation, because also you're still sisters and you're still a mum and a daughter, and you might still just have a row one day because, mums and daughters have a row, or siblings do, or,
Definitely,
in
definitely.
the middle of all that, which is normal but feels kind of different sometimes and heavier weighted because of the situation.
Yeah, yeah. And my sister moved away from she was at university at the time or like working, I think. Can't remember. She just started renting out a place with all of her friends and yet never lived there because she moved home and then I think there's times where you get to the point where you're so tired and so stressed and me and her, we don't argue, but we're very close sisters. So we have a few creative discussions. But they felt escalated because she was so out of her normal environment and so not burnt out, but like on the edge. And I forgot about that. I just assumed sometimes, oh, she's just living at home. But in reality, she felt like she was missing out on another part of her life. And that was really hard and took me a long time, and in hindsight, like, I should have realized that a lot quicker because no wonder we were having a few scraps because she's, like, on a completely different level. Her life's kinda completely turned upside down, and she didn't get a break. So, yeah, those conversations, like, we should have probably preempted that and created a little bit of time outside of that to get a bit of relief, which we started to do further down the line, and our extended family were amazing with that. They had a Tuesday morning coffee morning where my dad and his sisters and, like, their husbands all went out for a coffee, and it really broke up that cycle, but because he went off with other people, it gave mum and Emily a little bit of time to themselves, which was actually really nice.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and also then your dad's siblings are getting an opportunity to have some time with him as well, kind of without his family there as well. And yeah, I mean, they're great things to do. Can I ask at that time, and I know you've just described you're going away to Manchester, you're coming back, you're seeing the changes in your dad, your sister and your mum are with him every day, so maybe those changes are less obvious to them. But where did you get your support at that time? What things, if any, did you find helpful?
Um, so within the British Cycling setup, I had access to a psychology team who referred me, and I actually saw a grief counsellor because I couldn't figure out why I was having the feelings I was and the reactions I was, and we came to the conclusion that I'd started a grief process quite early on. So I had an outlet, which I was really fortunate to go and speak to someone and just let out what I'm feeling. And that ability to offload, because I wasn't going to offload onto the people I would normally offload onto because they were going through an awful lot at the same time as myself, was really helpful. And I also had a team around me who I could talk. So I had my friends that I would be able to offload onto or have a conversation. But also, what I found really useful was just having a break in terms of like we'd go out for coffee, but we wouldn't talk about it. We would just talk about anything. And it was a bit of a relief because it can feel really intense and like all consuming and that you need to think about it all the time and do as much as you can all the time. And it's constantly on your mind and you've got to make the most of everything. But that is exhausting. So having that relief was really helpful for me. And I was really fortunate that I had cycling as a break for me. Like I'd go to Manchester in the week, I'd go ride my bike and try and like do the best I could, and that was an absolute freedom, a bit of fun, an outlet for me to go and like express myself and like not think about other things. I was also doing a uni degree at the time, which kind of was a bit of a mental break, but was also quite tricky. And then I had the weekends, which were going home, spending time with dad, and that was like how I tried to kind of plan it. Obviously, you can't just switch off Monday to Friday with thinking about all those kinds of things, but making sure I was busy and having that support network and then the extra accessibility to speak to those people really was like it was helpful. It helped, like, we talked about a bucket and how full your bucket is. If you can just let a little bit of water out every now and then, it's not gonna overflow. So that was basically how we were managing it. We were trying to keep the bucket not quite full, just so we could keep functioning, keep going without having, like, an overflow and an overwhelming emotion that would kind of bring a halt to things.
I think that's a great description. There's a couple of things I just wanted to pick up on from what you said. One was that also, and slightly different to the bucket, I'm going to talk about a tank, but there's a need to top up the tank because, with things that you enjoy, so, or things that give you pleasure, or things that just take you out of what's happening. So, like you're saying, your university degree, and or going for coffee, and or speaking with a grief counsellor. So, doing some of those things to kind of fill your resources back up, and your resilience, because as you say, you can tell yourself at times that actually, oh, well, time's going to be really short, and I need to dedicate everything to this 24/7. But actually, that's just exhausting and not realistic, and also not sustainable for any length of time. So it's really important, isn't it, to do that kind of, to step out of it, to be able to top up the tank. I think that thing about being aware of that level as well is a similar thing in the bucket, so that it's not overflowing. And the other thing which you talked about, so there's something called anticipatory grief. There's research into anticipatory grief, and this is the grief which begins before someone's died. So it's the grief in anticipation of the death. Some researchers say that everyone starts that grieving process before the person dies, and the person themselves go through that as well, because there's a series of losses. You were just saying earlier, when your dad physically changed, then he was much less able to do things he'd been able to do even just weeks before, and then needed extra support from your mum and your sister. And so those losses are all part of that kind of grief process, when your body's changing, and when you're not able to do the things that you used to be able to do week on week. And you got to try and process those losses, as somebody who's dying, but actually they're going to happen really quick. And then those around you are trying to process them as well. I'll never forget, a colleague of mine many years ago said to me, it takes longer for the soul to catch up. And that just really made loads of sense. I can see you kind of nodding now and smiling, but I think there's something in that, isn't there? It's like your head can catch up sometimes a bit, but then it just takes longer for, well, maybe the soul to catch up, whatever that means. But yeah, so the anticipatory grief, and research shows as well with anticipatory grief that actually there can be very similar stages in that, like there are in the grief after someone dies, so that confusion, sometimes anger, frustration, needing to accept what's happening. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny what you said about the soul catching up. So my dad, who was actually disabled, he had a motorbike accident when he was quite young and lost the use of his right arm. So all through his life, he had a disability, but we didn't realize it was a disability for a long time, because he was the kind of person who, well, I can do it. I can do it. I'm going to do it. It's not going to stop me. And that's going to be it. And that was very much his core personality. And as time went on and he was becoming less able, he still thought, because he has always had that mentality, that he would be able to do it no matter what. And we remember having conversations, because obviously we were terribly worried about him. But he was so stubborn. He was like, I'm going out on a massive walk, or I'm going out on a bike ride. And we're all sat holding our breath, being like, oh my goodness. And we were overprotective as well of him at the time, because obviously we're holding on to everything that we can. And yet he's obviously very aware that he was less able, but somewhere deep down it was like, nope, I'm doing it. And it was still part of his core personality. And it was like that bit hadn't gone yet. And that was actually really nice. But also we were panicking at the same time.
I sort of, I don't know, I sort of thank God for stubbornness, and especially for him, because then it was just about maintaining. I mean, we can say maintaining independence, but actually it's just about
Mm,
maintaining quality of life and doing the things you like doing,
yeah.
isn't it? For as long as
Mm.
possible. Thank you. Can I ask about your dad's funeral? Was that something that had there been conversations about beforehand? Had he planned for it? Had he expressed any wishes?
Yeah, so he planned everything, down to the songs. Him and my mum had amazing conversations, and he was a planner, so he basically put down everything that he knew that he wanted to do, which made my mum's life and our life a lot easier. We'd not long been to another funeral for my granddad, my mum's dad. And so I don't know if that triggered as well a lot of we need to make sure we've got all of this planned out. But yeah, even down to the song, Heather Small, what have you done today to make you feel proud was like the song that everyone walked out to, which is very much him and made us all like chuckle as we left. But yeah, his funeral, it was a bit of a shock though. We put something on Facebook and he'd said where it was going to be. So we'd planned it all out and we turned up in the car and there's so many people there that couldn't even fit in to the venue. And even he hadn't, like, he was a lovely person. He was friends with everybody, but he hadn't anticipated, obviously, that the small venue that he picked was not going to accommodate everyone. Which is actually really lovely and overwhelming turning up about how many people wanted to come and say goodbye. But yeah, that having had that conversation with mom, I think it meant that she could also just like sink into the funeral and not have to stress about, oh, we got the right venue. Is this what he would have wanted? We were just kind of there and present and really took it in. And it was very him, like even the songs and like the way it was happening. And yeah, it was quite, it's really weird to say it, but it was not quite nice as far as funerals go. Not that like it's a very nice thing to talk about. But yeah, and it meant that we could, yeah, just take in that. I still can't get over how many people turned up. We turned around the corner and I just started crying because it was a crematorium and there's a car park right next to it. And as we drove in, like, there was just not that many like space for the cars to go through. There was just people everywhere. And like, yeah, that was just, it was credit to him, massive credit to him. And then, yeah, of course, we left to What Have You Done Today to Make You Feel Proud, which quite a positive tune to walk out to, but very much him. So we knew that it was exactly what he wanted.
How nice. I think I can hear, that you turn around the corner in the car and you arrive and you see all them people, and yes, it's lovely and it's amazing that everybody's turned out, but at the same time, really overwhelming as well, isn't
Really
it?
overwhelming.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I was just kind of, I think from your description of your dad, I was wondering whether, him planning all of that right down to the detail of the songs and everything was his way of lifting some of the load from your mum and yourself and your sister. Because maybe just, knowing that whenever any of us lose a loved one, whenever somebody close to us dies, we've got enough to deal with emotionally, haven't we? And practically, there's so much to do after someone dies as well. So it sounds like he was given a bit of a helping hand there with some of that.
100%. That's very much him as well, taking charge. But my mum was amazing throughout the whole time. She used to be a nurse. So I feel like her expertise like went into overdrive when she knew she had to start caring for him. And I think he just always said how amazing she was through the whole thing. And it was really hard on her anyway. But yeah, I think that was almost you've done your job. I can sort this bit out, which is quite nice. They were quite a good team, so I feel like that was how it almost ended as well, being a good team. And yeah, he would do anything that he could, just to even out the workload.
Yeah, I love that. I just want, if it's okay with you, I'd like to go on to talk about bereavement and your experience of grief after your dad had died. But just before I do that, Sophie, can I ask, are you happy to share your dad's name?
Yeah, his name was Nigel.
Nigel. Okay, thank you. So, how was and how is, because of course this was only in 2021 and we can't and we shouldn't be putting timelines on grief and bereavement. And how has it been for you?
Really strange. It's been a bit of a roller coaster. And even like that first initial loss when he decided he wasn't going to have treatment anymore, from that point on, a lot of things changed. I had a very different circle of friends from that point because there were some that did understand and some that just couldn't wrap their head around it. And obviously, then you gravitate to the people who are able to support you a bit better. So that was almost like a really obvious first kind of change. And then as that year went on, things kind of stayed pretty stable. It's a bit weird, but I was away racing the week before he passed, came home, and then my mum called me and said, "You need to come home." So I went home, saw him, had a really lovely goodbye, He was like, "Love you." And even at that point, he was like, not in like a not very nice way, but mentally he was starting to struggle. So he wasn't always like completely with it. So for me to get that goodbye was very special. And I went back to Manchester that night, and then I got a phone call the next morning, finding out the news. And it was really odd immediately because you're very sad, but you don't really know what to do. Um, Myself, my mum, and my sister all had the same kind of feeling. We just had this like emptiness. And because we'd been so busy, myself going up and down the M6 motorway, my mum caring, my sister caring for him, and things like that, we went from that to not having anything to do, which we all found really hard because where do you direct all of your energy all of a sudden? So I actually had the World Championships the week after, so we all decided to go to the World Championships, which was actually quite helpful at the time. It was very difficult for us, but at least we were doing something, and it was doing something that Dad would have had to go at us if we didn't do. So we felt almost obliged to do it, which also helped because we had something to occupy our time and our minds a little bit. It wasn't just thinking about what are we doing and how sad we were and how much we missed him. But because that worked for me, what then I did is I just kept going, in terms of my training and that kind of lifestyle. But that's when the, like, bereavement really started to catch up with me. Mentally, I was really struggling to, like, keep functioning as if things were normal. I don't think I actually allowed myself to stop. And as I said earlier, like, I'm really fortunate that I have such a great setup around the cycling team and also around, like, my friends and the people who I get on with, because one of my coaches at the time, who I got on really well with, just turned around to me and went, "You need to go and look after yourself and take some time and do nothing and take it in. Like, please leave." In the nicest way possible, please leave.
They seen it.
So, yes, I would think I became not a very functioning human, but in my head, I was functioning because I could do things, but there was no person behind the doing the things. So I went home and we spent time with family, and I think it was getting really close to Christmas. And obviously that's a really triggering time for a lot of people because that was our first Christmas without somebody who was very close to us, and Christmas is a lot all about family for us as well. So I think I just said, "Can we go away? Can we not do Christmas at home? Please, can we go somewhere else?" So we ended up going to the Lake District last minute, all of the family, because it was my granddad who we passed as well. His daughters and my nan on that side also were going through grief at Christmas as well. So we all just basically got in our cars and head up to Lake District, somewhere that we hadn't all been as a family, somewhere completely new, somewhere that was a little bit away from everything at home. Um, and that was really good for us because it gave us time together to sit in that grief and that bereavement, and we could talk about them, but it wasn't too close to home that it was almost like triggering is quite a strong word, but it didn't feel sad in the same way because we were also doing something different. So I think it allowed us to have a lot of those feelings away in an environment that felt like you could escape that feeling if you needed to, which was really helpful for us. And then as time went on, it doesn't really get easier, does it? But you kind of learn to carry it with you. So it got a little bit better. Me and my sister and my mum were starting to understand a bit more of each other's grief as well. Because as we spoke earlier, obviously everyone's going through different things. And then I saw something, I think it was online actually, that really perfectly described it, but they call them like grief bombs. So you get into yourself into a situation where you kind of hit in the face with the grief that you've gone through, and it feels like quite fresh again. And because my dad was so enwrapped in my cycling career, he was a big part of it growing up. He was a coach, he was a role model to me. He used to drive me around to all my races. I had a race at the Commonwealth Games, and from both myself, my mum, and my sister, it was very like real for us at that time. It brought up a lot of the earlier grief feelings because it's something as a family we'd all talked about going to and we're doing, and he'd looked to buy tickets for it, and it was the first kind of like situation after like a Christmas holiday that felt like he wasn't there and he should have been there. So there was a lot of emotions like that was brought back up again, and it's that overwhelming feeling and that confusion a little bit, and you just feel out of place. I don't know how else to kind of describe it except for like something is wrong. You can't fix that feeling that is wrong. And it's a bit like disorientating, if anything. And there's not really many ways you can navigate it except for like talking to people and getting through it. And that's also a really strange thing because as a family, we're all doers and you kind of just have to plow through it and sit with it and there's nothing you can really do about it apart from get through it, which is very different to like most things.
Can't fix it.
Yeah, exactly. You can't fix it. There's nothing you can do about it. But knowing and talking about how each other were feeling was so comforting. Having people who you could talk to about it. I'm a crier anyway. So I just forewarned everyone that there might be a few extra tears. But having that understanding like gives you that space then to have those feelings and have those emotions. And I think it's really important to not stop them. You need to feel them and go through them rather than holding off and holding off and holding off. Because it's a little bit like that bucket. You can hold off as long as you want, but the splash will be a lot bigger if you're gonna pour it all out at once kind of thing. So yeah, that was how it is. And there's been a few instances since that like have brought up things like that, a few grief bombs as you will. But over time I feel like I've now got better tools to kind of cope with it and I've got a really good support network, which has been amazing. And that's what really helps. Because people, when they have that understanding, they can give you the space that you need and they can give you the support that you need. And I have friends who know that when I'm in that space, I need distracting and I need to go and have a bit of fun. And I have other friends who know that when I speak to them, they just need to sit there and listen and I'll just absolutely offload onto them. And that's great as well. But that understanding has built over time and that's also been really helpful. And I still miss him obviously terribly every day. But it's more of a positive thing now, if that makes sense. Initially, it was quite I can't believe he's not here. Whereas now it's nicer to think about him and I'm allowing myself to think about him. And like I went and won an Olympic gold medal this year and everyone who watched it saw me absolutely sobbing my eyes out on the telly. But I know in that moment, obviously I missed him terribly, but I also know he would have been proud of me. Whereas 2 years ago at the Commonwealth Games, I just felt horrifically sad that he wasn't there. And that I couldn't bring myself to get to that positive point ever in any part of it because all I was doing is sitting in that grief and just absolutely all encompassed by it. Whereas obviously now I've got a lot more hindsight and a lot more perspective on it. So I was able to like have both sides, which is a lot better and a lot nicer.
That is wonderful. Thank you. Honestly, you just said so much. There's so many golden nuggets in what you've just said, definitely for people listening who are grieving, but I think also just how you described since 2021 to today and how it's evolving and not going away and not being immediately fixed and having to sit with it, but what you do with it and reaching out and talking to people. I mean, I was really struck by your coach seeing what you were unable to see. And of course, we're not able to see it because for you, you're just functioning, you're getting on with it. But actually, you were running on an empty tank, weren't you? So there's that thing about kind of literally almost being dead behind the eyes and, robotic, almost like a kind of robot.
That's exactly what they
And
said. Yeah.
yeah. And I think it's a very common experience, that people have with grief. I've never heard the grief bombs before, but I really like that because it's so true. And I know from my own experiences personally, but also from the many, many people I've spoken to who've experienced bereavement. And people will say sometimes it can even hit you like when you're in Tesco's, or just the
Yes.
kind of most random of places. And you can get a grief bomb, and I'm guessing the bomb. Now you've got me off on train of thought thinking about the grief bombs, but I'm imagining that. Well, certainly in my experience, but they come in different sizes as well. Sometimes they can be kind of just smaller ones, and then sometimes bigger ones with a bit more of a punch.
Yeah, definitely. I had one the other day. It was really, really odd. I went to pick up the phone to call him. Now, it's been a long time since I've had that reaction to something, but I saw something really small, and in my head, I was like, "Oh, he'd like to hear about that." And went to dial, and then I was like, "Oh," and it just hits you, doesn't it? And then your body's like not in touch with your brain because your brain had that habit that's still there, and yet your body's gone, "No, no, no, that's not something you can do anymore," and then you just have that wave of realization, even though that's constantly there. It's not like you didn't know, it's not that that wasn't a thing, but it just kinda catches you off guard, and you just have to go, "Okay, that's okay," and go and have a cry and maybe call someone else and have a chat about it with them, but yeah, it just catches you, but if you know that that's a possibility, like, it was really easy for me when I saw it online. I don't know who put it up, but I could then label it as, "That's a grief bomb. You're fine. It's
Yeah.
okay." Like,
Yeah.
just feel what you're feeling and then you can move on a little bit rather than it catching you off guard and be like, what just happened? At least you can call it something. That's why I quite like that term.
Every 5 minutes, someone dies without the care they need. The Great Daffodil Appeal is your chance to change that. By donating and wearing your daffodil this March, you'll help give people the expert end-of-life care they need, whatever the illness. Visit mariecurie.org.uk/daffodil to get involved.
Yeah, definitely. And also, there's a beginning and a middle and an end to it. That at that moment. So you're not completely overwhelmed by it or completely freaked out by it. It's like, and so by having a term, and it's like, that's what it is. And this is what happens. And then this is when it finishes. And then this is what I do to help myself. And then this is what I do to kind of carry on. Congratulations on your amazing successes.
Thank you.
That must have been a really lovely, happy cry, sad cry, everything cry moment. And then on reflection, having that kind of realization that actually they were really positive thoughts of your dad's, feelings about your success and that moment, and what it would have meant to him and his pride, in his daughter.
Yeah, so it's something I've spoken to him about for years. Growing up, my goal as a kid, everyone's like, "What do you want to be when you're older?" And I'd be like, "World and Olympic champion." Like I was that kid at school, and
Love it.
I've had a lot of turbulence through my own career. I got to a point where I didn't see eye to eye with people, in not in like a conflicting way, but in a way that we couldn't figure out what worked for me. And I went from being a really successful junior to just all my progress halted. And my dad was seeing that and he was doing whatever he could to help behind the scenes, but he didn't want to overly get involved. And there was a point where we questioned whether I'd even get to the point of being in contention for the games and things like that. And I just missed out on Tokyo, getting selected. And he was with me, like going through all of that with the selections and things like that. And that was really difficult. And it's something we'd always talked about. And then all of a sudden, I became an Olympian this year, and that was amazing. And then I was like, I can't call him and tell him. And I was like, but he'd be so proud, but I can't call him and tell him. And then we got to the games and we weren't the favorites like for a long time. And all of a sudden we went and won. And it was just like overwhelming, surreal day. And I vividly remember I went up to the stands, like we were riding around the track. I'd go up to the top of the barrier and I was hugging mum and I was hugging Emily and then I was hugging my team. And then they took loads of pictures. And as we were leaving the track, I look up to see my mum and my sister. And I think the only thought that was going across my mind was dad should have been here. And all of a sudden, you say I was an everything cry. It was an ugly cry. I think I just started absolutely sobbing. And I'd put plans in place. I said, with my psych team and the people who were there in support, I said, this is what's going to happen. If it goes well, there will be an overwhelming amount of promotion. If it also goes bad, or no matter what happens, it's going to be like that. But I said, if it goes really well, because it's always the good stuff that I find the hardest, I think, because they're the people you celebrate with. Well, that's the people I would celebrate with. And it's that you don't get to see the pride on their face. You know that they would be proud, but you don't get to see it or experience it. You don't get to hug them. You don't get to show them or talk about it. So I just remember it was like I didn't even have a choice in what was happening. I was just crying like a lot. And I went to the person who I'd planned to go straight to, although it was quite difficult to get to them at that point because everyone was celebrating and I was there crying my eyes out. And I had a moment where we kind of like looked at each other because we were originally going to like quickly we do this thing where I'll say everything I'm feeling and I can park it or put it to the side. But because I've let it out, like that's how I kind of cope and go through those emotions. But I didn't have time. So we did this thing where we looked at each other and she was like, I understand. And I was like, I'm telling you now, this is how I'm feeling. And then I actually got to then enjoy the moment as well. And people would ask and say, your dad would be so proud of you. And my team were great because when I couldn't speak, they would speak for me. And it gave me that little bit of a window because I didn't have to go straight into talking about how happy I was to sit with that. And I thought that was really special because although I was sad at the same time as being really happy, because I had a team who then were able to go speak to the media and I was allowed to just have a moment. That moment was quite special because I'm also grateful that I was able to be sad about it because obviously he's a massive part of my journey and I got to miss him. And that also shows how special he was in my relationship, in my cycling career. And I got a minute just to think about him in that moment as well. And yeah, okay, there's millions of pictures of me crying all over the telly, but at least that's a part of him now that's all over the media and all over my face as well, which I'm quite proud of, that I got to have that moment after the win. And yeah, it was pretty cool.
It's really beautiful. And, you got the moment. I think that was the moment you were celebrating with him.
Yeah, I got to celebrate with everybody, and then I had that moment to celebrate with him, which was quite very special.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that. So my next question is, do you ever think about your own death?
Yes and no. When I was a lot younger, I did a lot. And that's a bit of a strange thing to say, but you think about your own mortality a little bit, don't you? And yeah, when Dad was going through what he was going through, you think forward a little bit to hoping that you get to have these experiences going on in your life, to live it before you get to the point where you can't anymore. I live a very cool life, so I feel very grateful for that. And I think that kind of almost hinders those, like, I don't think about my own mortality that much. I do sometimes think, because of Dad's death and then we've experienced a lot of grief in the family, I sometimes have these moments where I, like, not panic, but like worry that I've not moved on through chapters of my life very quickly, because you want to do everything you can while you can. And I think I've got more perspective on that than some of my friends because of obviously all of the grief that we've gone through and the loss. But yeah, sometimes you think about it. But I think more about what I'm trying to live rather than the death, if that makes sense. So I'm just trying to make the most of what I can. And I think that's quite a cool thing. And it took me a long time to get to that point. It almost took me until the Olympics this year I felt like I had to heal to get back to a point where I was able to then fully embrace life and fully live it. But now that's what I'm kind of doing. And it doesn't mean like having to go skydiving and throw myself on all these adrenaline things, but I'm very sentimental. I try and make the most of every moment. I try and have memories of every moment and try and do things that are really meaningful to me. And that's more what I think about than the death side. But I guess they kind of come hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah. And I think that, that description of, on occasions in the past, having that kind of panic feeling about, am I doing kind of, everything as I wanted to do? Then I think that comes with when you've experienced loss as well, definitely. And when you've experienced death, because, people talk about us being faced with our own mortality and faced with our own kind of lifespan when we're grieving, when we're caring for somebody who's dying, or when we know someone who's close to us who's dying. Is legacy something that's important to you, as in how you'd like to be remembered?
Yeah, I think so. But that, again, that comes off the back of my dad. My dad has a massive legacy. The impact he had through like the communities that we're in is huge. And it's really special to me that is the impact he's had on people. People come up and talk to me all the time about him, and I'm like, I didn't even know you knew him. And he's had that effect on you. And I think that's what anyone would kind of want in the world, or a lot of people at least. Legacy is amazing. Like, you look at people who are so influential to the general population and like the impact that they have. It doesn't have to be always on that massive grand stage, but the legacy you carry on through is almost like and try not to be too morbid of a way, but like a goodbye note. Like, if you can pass on a legacy that continues after you're gone, that if you've got a legacy, it's a positive thing. You've influenced people to carry that on. You've influenced people to hold that close to them. And it's special to a lot of people if there's a legacy going on. How amazing is that? That's almost like your life has been a gift to somebody else in a way, in a nice way. How amazing would that be? I feel like if everyone would love to have a legacy. And I think the impact you have on the world, you've got a bigger say than you think. Like, I've learned that recently as well. I started speaking out on things that I'm really passionate about, and like the uptake on it has been amazing. And you think, oh wow, like, I mean, I took influence from my dad, who would just tell everybody anything he thought, and that's why he was who he was. But like, how amazing is that his legacy is continuing? And I think, well, if he can do that, why can't I do that? But yeah, it's a bit of a strange one at the same time though, because obviously usually a legacy happens after somebody passes away, or like it becomes stronger or more held on to. But yeah, if you have that impact on somebody or a few people, like, that's very cool.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And just before I ask my last question, was there anything you wanted to mention today on the podcast that I've not asked you or that we've not talked about?
I mean, the only thing that we haven't really touched on is like the negative relationship kind of things through it. So like a lot of you touched briefly on it, but like the anger and going back into your normal life, or what you would deem as your normal life after everything had happened, which was very, very weird. And it's something I have to catch myself quite often, talk like with people. Some people have like really what I would deem as a small problem. It's not a small problem to them because it's as big as you've experienced. But especially in those first few months after losing dad, myself, my mum, and my sister all experienced this weird thing of like, you don't know what a problem is. You just want to scream at people and be like, that is not a serious problem. You're fine. And it's almost like you almost judge people's coping strategies and like their reactions to things. And it's really hard to bring yourself back because obviously you have a brand new perspective and your barometer of what is bad has gone through the roof. So then everything is a different perspective to you, to everyone else. But it's really hard to kind of slot yourself back into that almost real world situation because you feel like nobody understands you anymore. You feel so isolated in your perspective and what you think. It can be so lonely. And also you just have that anger that's just like, and I know it's a stage of grief as well, but like you catch yourself being like, why does nobody get it? Why can nobody understand? Why are they acting like this? And it's not their fault for saying, coming to you with their problems, because that's a normal human thing. But in your head, you're like, why are you coming to me with this when I've got so much worse going on? Just really peculiar. And like almost that as well, slotting back into like a normal routine as well. I had so much guilt when I was enjoying myself for a long time. And that was odd because you're like, I thought I wasn't allowed to be happy for a long time, which is very punishing, especially if you're already going through like a lot of sadness and things like that. Because every time you enjoy yourself, you're like, oh, well, they're not here though, and you should be sad. And that's not true, but that's a very common reaction that I've found that I've seen a lot of other people feel, like that guilt of like, oh, I'm going to go enjoy myself. Oh, well, should you be enjoying yourself? Well, yes, you should. It's so, so peculiar. And that normal life slotting in, I think we didn't speak about that at all, but it's not, you've got to find a new normal. That's the thing I wish I would have known is you have to find a new normal. You can't just slot back in and it be like, right, back to normal life, because that doesn't happen. You have to figure it out and I have to go through that. And I think if I was aware of that, you could be more active about it than passive. So a lot of it for me, like I was like, I wasn't actively trying to find a new normal. I was forcing my way back into what I already thought was normal. And then you end up sitting in this like turmoil for much longer. And then when I realized that it was like, no, I need to find that, it was a lot easier for me to navigate it to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did say near the beginning how it was life changing, how everything changed from that day when your dad died. And actually, those great examples and great top tips, actually, for people listening as well, is, that finding the new normal, because nothing's going to be the same again, or lots of things are going to be very different and surprising things, as you've just described so eloquently. But that kind of, yeah, sort of, hearing people moan on about something, it's just like, what are you talking about? It's kind of, that's that's not an issue.
Yeah.
This is an issue. My dad's just died. And then how do you manage them feelings? How do you manage that frustration and anger and all them feelings that are brewing up as well? What do you do with it? And what do you do with them? And as you say, you want to, in one part of the brain, you're kind of thinking, yeah, well, of course you're going to say that because you always say that. And I would have said exactly the same before my dad died, but actually things have totally changed now. And what you're saying is just totally winding me up. And what am I going to do with this?
Yeah, definitely.
What did you do with it?
We, as a family, like me, my sister, and my mum spoke about it a lot because that was that's something we all had in common. That was really helpful. It took me a really long time though to figure out some of the other things that went on. I think that is something that is taken years for me to figure out, rather than just like the short initial kind of, I say initial grief. It doesn't end, but it's like a wave, isn't it? The first bit. So yeah, and I think I'm still learning. I'm still getting it, like handling it. But I think the biggest thing has been talking about it. That's been the biggest thing that has helped. Now, whether that's helping somebody else through a bit of grief, or talking to somebody else who understands grief, or just talking about it in general, because it's really easy to think that you know. It's a bit like when my coach sent me home. You don't see it yourself, but when you kind of like verbalize it and you hear and you're listening to yourself, you probably have a better chance of like that realization of, oh, that's not normal, or oh, that might need to change, or this isn't quite right. And also other people can reflect that back on you as well. And yeah, I think that's been the biggest thing, I guess, is like you think you can stay in your own head, but there's only so much that can stay in your own head.
Mm. Mm. If somebody's listening now who's grieving, who's maybe lost a parent and or lost anyone, any other bits of advice?
I think, and this is not a very nice one, but don't expect everyone who was there for you to be there for you. Not everyone knows how to navigate grief and loss. And my circles changed massively through that time. I had people who, it wasn't a mean way, but like it wasn't a priority for them. They had other things going on in their life and they didn't know how to navigate it. And I found that really hard. And I almost like, you almost grieve some of the friendships that you lose through that time in addition, because there were people I thought were gonna be there for me and they weren't able to be, or they just weren't, and that's just the blank reality of it. But the people who were, you cling on to, and I still value those people today massively, because even if they can't understand, they try, and the trying is so special. When you understand that from someone who's lost perspective, like it's pretty cool, and that's sometimes all you want is someone just to be like, "Well, I'm here if you want a hug." And that's huge. And then the other thing is you feel so alone because, as you mentioned earlier, like everyone's grief experience, even if you've been in the same situation, like you both been living, say, with the person that you've lost, or you've both experienced the same processes, you will have experienced the grief differently anyway, because you're different people, your brain works in different ways. And so it can feel really lonely and isolating, and either nobody understands you, or why am I feeling it different to everyone else? But you're not alone in that grief. Someone else might be going through grief, or someone else is there to support you. And I did isolate myself a lot because I felt really lonely, and like I felt a very specific way, and that I couldn't talk to people about it because I didn't get it. But that's not the case. And it was better when I realized that as well. But then I think one of the number ones is you are allowed to be happy. And you have to, if you can't remind yourself of that, somebody else, ask a friend or ask a family member or ask a member of staff near you, that just to like, when you catch yourself going, I shouldn't be happy, they can prompt you and go, you're allowed to enjoy yourself now. Like, that's okay. Have a bit of fun. Like, have a friend who's designated to help you get to have a bit of fun, because those moments help you get through as well, massively. And if you take them away, obviously, it's not a very pleasurable experience anyway, but it makes it a little bit harder. So
That's amazing advice. Thank you so much. Just before we go, how has it been today being on the Marie Curie couch and having this conversation?
great. I love to talk about it. I'm trying to speak more openly about it as well, because something I've realized is that when I was grieving, I would scroll through the internet and see if there's something I can relate to, or what other people going through. How do they feel? Like, why do we not talk about it more? And then I realized that it was really helpful for me when I saw, that's how I learned about the word grief bomb and things like that. And things like the anger that people felt towards people, or experiences people have felt, because like, for instance, like when I spoke about how I felt like my dad had given up in that first instance, like other people feel like that as well with their parents when they're going through similar things. It's like, oh, it's not just me being like a not very nice person, that's a very normal thing, and other people have felt the same, and things like that. I think that's really helped, and I think talking about it is, the more we can talk about it, you don't normalize those feelings, but it makes it a little more normal inside your brain, which is quite helpful, obviously. And any tips, obviously, that we can give to help out and things like that. Like, it doesn't go away. Grief never goes away. Another thing I read this the other day is, it's like a rock that you've got in your pocket. When it's first in there, it's really sharp, it's really painful, it's really heavy. And it's like, what? I can't get rid of this rock, but it's there. But as time goes on, you get used to the feeling and you get a bit stronger, so it doesn't feel as heavy. And the sharp edges might round off a little bit with it like rubbing around in your jeans or whatever. But it's always there. But you kind of learn to handle the fact that it's always there a little bit better. And the more you can talk about it, the more you know about it, the more you feel normal, the easier it gets. So yeah.
I love the rock. and just the kind of, and then it getting to the point where it's just a really, really gorgeous, shiny pebble that you can just keep in your hand or keep in your pocket for always. Love that. Sophie Capewell, thank you so much for joining me on the Marie Curie couch. Thank you for being so open and honest and sharing some of your dad Nigel's story and your granddad, and for all of your great words of wisdom. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help. From planning ahead to coping with bereavement, you can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. This podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Content. The music featured is Time Lapse by Panoceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening. Until next time, goodbye.